Welcome everyone. Today we're honored to have Graur giving a special talk. I've known Or for a long time. I can't count how many years. I probably could if I thought about it. But
we're not good at math.
I'm not good at maths. So Or did his PhD in astrophysics at Tel Aviv University with Danny Maus, and then he did a postdoc at Johns Hopkins with Adam Rees, is that
yep.
right? And followed by fellowships, NSF fellowships at New York University and the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, where I overlapped with him. Mm-hmm. Then now he's moved to this side. I guess you kind of follow me.
I did, yeah.
To this country. And he's an associate professor now at University of Portsmouth. So most of his research concerns supernovae. Not so much the mainstream type 1a supernova that we use for cosmology, but kind of oddballs or really late observations or kind of out of the normal track, right? Would you characterize that?
Well, the rate stuff is everything. The rates includes normal supernovae, but otherwise, yeah, I try to stay as far away as possible from supernova cosmology.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, but here we'll learn that Or is a polymath, maths, I don't know. And he's going to talk to us about something else that he's been doing, about cultural astronomy, I guess.
Yeah.
So, wait.
Okay, so thank you, Casey, for that introduction, and thank you, everyone, for coming in today. I'm going to talk about the Milky Way and the ancient Egyptian goddess of the sky. And as Casey said, I'm an astrophysicist. I usually talk about supernovae and tidal disruption events, and my group has had a few publications just the last few weeks. My graduating PhD student, Joe Callow, just published his first author paper in which he measured the rates of extreme corona line emitting galaxies and compared them to the rates of tidal disruption events. There's also a paper by my former postdoc, Peter Clark, about an interesting nuclear transient called AT 2018 DYK, which he shows quite definitively was caused by a tidal disruption event. And though I do try to stay away from supernova cosmology as much as possible, I do have a paper from last year where I show that underluminous 91 BG-like type 1a supernovae are also standardizable candles and can be used for cosmology if you want to. But yeah, today I'm going to talk about cultural astronomy. And this came about because I also write popular science books. And I recently published one about galaxies, in which I had to write a chapter about the Milky Way. And in it, I wanted to explain the origin of our galaxy's name and origin story. And that comes from the Greeks and the Romans, and I won't go into it here. What I do want to talk about is what happened next, right? Most astronomers would probably stop at the Greco-Roman origin story. I didn't want to. I wanted to show stories from all over the world. So I started collecting names and origin stories, and it became a bit of an obsession. To the point where I'm still collecting names and origin stories, and it's become a third part of my research program. And it became an obsession because I noticed a recurrent motif. We're scientists, we look for correlations, we look for patterns, and I noticed that instead of finding many different names and origin stories, I kept seeing the same ones over and over again. The Milky Way was conceptualized as a road, a river, a god, an animal, or a conduit between this life and the next. And that told me that all of these stories must originate in some shared human imagination, which means that no matter where you are in the world, no matter what era you live in, when you look up at the sky, you're drawing inspiration from the same deep well that everyone else all over the world is when they're doing the same. And while writing this, I wanted to show what the Milky Way was in ancient Egypt. I wanted something really, really ancient. And I started looking into this issue, and I learned that the ancient Egyptians were astronomers in the same sense as all cultures. They observed the sun, the moon, the planets, the stars. They observed their motions across the sky. They used them. They used stars as star clocks during the night. They used different constellations to align their temples. And they incorporated all of this into their religion and material culture and mythology. This, for example, is the astronomical ceiling from the tomb of Seti I in the Valley of the Kings. The top part is basically a table of Deccan stars, stars and constellations which Egyptologists think were used as a star clock. At the bottom, you have the northern constellations. So what then did they think about the Milky Way? Well, it wasn't clear. There were a few possibilities in the literature. Two of them come from specific terms whose meaning isn't fully known until this very day. The first is something called Mesechet Sechedu, which Egyptologists in the late 19th century translated as a path of stars, and they understood that to be the Milky Way. Maybe because the Egyptologist who translated it was German, Kurt Sette, and in German the Milky Way is called Milchstraße, as in a road of milk. And so they started thinking of that as the Milky Way. More modern translations by James Allen have this as a path of sailing stars or a path of beaten stars, and it's still unclear what exactly is meant here. Then we have another term, Mernecha, which is translating as the winding waterway or the Ha Canal. Again, not quite clear. What is clear about it is that it is supposed to ferry the sun and the dead king from the west to the east before the dead king is reborn and goes up to the sky to join the imperishable stars. The third suggestion was that the Milky Way was a representation of the sky goddess Nut, or that in other words, you can think of the Milky Way as a constellation, and Nut as that constellation. And that was interesting. Now, I really wanted to include this in my book. I really wanted to include this image. It's a beautiful image, but I had a rule that said that I can't include anything unless I trace it back to its source. So I started looking into this. And I went on and on and on and on. And I spent quite a bit of time at the libraries here in Cambridge, the UL, the Haddon, and at the different museums, at the Fitzwilliam. And here's what I learned. So Egyptian cosmology developed independently in several cities and also probably evolved throughout time. When we talk about ancient Egypt, we're talking about a period that lasts 3,000 to 3,500 years. So please keep that in mind, because there is no reason to assume that something that was true 5,000 years ago was viewed the same way 4,000 years ago, and 3,000 years ago, and 2,000 years ago. So different cosmologies developed in different places across Egypt. One of the main ones developed in Heliopolis, and here the story goes that in the beginning was the void, and the void was just an endless, watery, inert ocean. And out of that void, the god Atum created himself. And he then set to create the other gods and the rest of the world. And so he created Shu and Tefnut by sneezing or ejaculating them, depending on the version. And then Shu and Tefnut together gave birth to Geb and Nut. And Geb and Nut then had 2 sons, Osiris and Set, and 2 daughters, Isis and Nephthys. These different gods embody certain aspects of the world. Shu is the air or the atmosphere, Tefnut is moisture, Geb is earth, Nut is sky, Osiris, Set is the power of chaos, and in his vying for power with his brother Osiris, he slew Osiris, and Osiris was then brought back to life by Isis, so that Osiris became the embodiment of death and rebirth, and Isis is connected to that. And Osiris and Isis then had a son, Horus, who continued to vie with his uncle Set for power in Egypt. Horus ended up winning, and Horus embodies the kingship. Now, this is one of the images for this creation story. At the bottom here, we have the void embodied as the god Nun, and he raises the solar bark out of the waters of the void. The sun here is shown both as a solar disk and as the scarab god Khepri. And above that, you see in white, this is Osiris, who is entwined around the netherworld, the Duat, and he holds up this smaller black figure who is Nut, and she, as the sky, receives the sun. So Nut is the goddess of the sky. She is the sky. In that role, she protects the earth, her brother Geb, who is shown reclining at her feet, from being flooded by the void. And she is held aloft by her father Shu, who is the atmosphere. So you have here a vision of the world, right? Earth, sky, and the sky is being held up by the air. There is also a story about how in the beginning Geb and Nut were inseparable. Okay, Nut was already pregnant with their children, but they were just inseparable, as happens with young lovers. And Shu had to step in, and he had to tear them apart. And that is also embodied here. The sun moving across the sky is often depicted as a god sailing in a bark along Nut's back. Okay? And the daily solar cycle is embodied in 2 ways. It's shown as a story of aging and as a story of death and rebirth. Here you see the story. Here you see it as a story of aging, where in the morning the sun rises and is embodied by the god Khepri. The midday sun is the god Ra, and as it sets in the evening, it's embodied by the god Atum, who is shown here as an old man. When the sun sets in the west, it is swallowed by Nut, and the sun then travels through the netherworld. And for a time, the netherworld was envisioned to be the inside of Nut's body. Okay, so it sails through the netherworld, and there are several books that describe the sun's journey through the Duat. And then at midnight, it meets Osiris. And Osiris basically hugs the sun and re-enervates it, gives life to it again. And then the sun can continue on its journey, and Nut can give birth to it once again so that it can rise in the east for a new day. Okay, so keep this image in mind, this image of an arched woman, sometimes covered in stars or solar disks, who is the sky. In the early 90s, 3 Egyptologists independently drew attention to the archness of this figure. And they said, you know what else looks like an arch? The Milky Way in the night sky. And they then tried to argue why the sky goddess Nut should be the Milky Way. The first one, Virginia Davis, didn't really put forth an argument. She just said, this looks right. The second one, Ronald Wells, who was also an astronomer, he tried to approach this by looking at equinoxes and solstices and how the ecliptic crossed or didn't cross the Milky Way at those specific times. And using planetarium software of the day, he came to the conclusion that as a constellation, Nut's head would be in Gemini and her groin would be in Cygnus. He needed her head in Gemini because the ecliptic crosses Gemini. I don't remember which one of the equinoxes or solstices. And then he had her groin in Cygnus because he thought that that bifurcation of the Milky Way could be her legs. And he decided that the Egyptians would also have seen the constellation we call Cygnus, or the Northern Cross, as a cross. And he decided that, and I'm quoting, not my words, since most primitive societies label female crotches on figurines with crosses, then the Egyptians would have done the same. There are collections of prehistoric Egyptian figurines. They do not bear such crosses. Not only that, but for Wells's model to work, he needed the date when Nut seems to swallow the sun and the date when the sun again, when she gives birth to it once again, to be 9 months apart. And he thought that worked because what else is 9 months long? A human pregnancy. Okay, cool. Except that he had, in doing so, he turned a daily phenomenon, the daily solar cycle, into something that has to last 9 months. I did not love this. In 2 separate papers, Ariel Kozlov made a completely different argument. Ariel Kozlov was a curator of the Egyptian collections in, I don't remember which museum at this moment, and she looked at so-called swimming girl cosmetic spoons. These are 2 of the better examples, but they all basically look like this. You have a mostly naked woman holding some kind of receptacle. The receptacles are usually ducks or basins like the one below, but you also get a gazelle or a lotus flower here and there. And Ariel Kozlov decided there was a lot of symbolism imbued in these swimming girl spoons, and that everything was a pun. So the duck is actually a pun for Geb, who is known as the great honker. And the lotus flower is a pun for the mythological story of the sun god being born out of a lotus. So the lotus is really a stand-in for the sun, and so on and so forth. And she came to the conclusion that these swimming girls, they were nut, and they were holding a constellation. They were holding the sun, or they were holding a goose or duck-like constellation. What duck-like or goose-like constellation do we have in the sky? Cygnus, the swan. Except, she said, there are no swans in Egypt, which is wrong. And so the Egyptians, again I'm quoting, must have seen a different long-necked bird in that constellation. Why not have it a goose and then it's Geb and then it works out? And so that's how she then oriented Nut on the sky. It's a different orientation from the one used by Wells, but okay. In a paper that's now doing the rounds between journals, I looked into these swimming girl spoons, placed them in the context of the rest of material culture from the same period when they were made, and I showed that basically, no, they don't show Nut. They're showing servant girls who were usually shown mostly naked, but usually wearing a belt, hoop earrings, and a collar. And you see them in lots of different murals and ostraca and papyri, including the famous erotic papyrus in the museum in Turin. They're humans, okay? They're human women serving the upper classes of Egyptian society. They are not the sky goddess. Okay, but we are academics, and as all academics know, once you publish something and you give a few talks about it, people will start to cite you. And once 2 people cite your paper, that's it. It has become truth with a capital T, and will continue to be cited indefinitely. And this is what happened here, okay? Most Egyptologists, if they think about this at all, will today tell you that yes, Nut is the Milky Way, and she's a constellation on the sky. I didn't like these, okay? I did not like these arguments, and I came to the conclusion that I can't use this in my book, which was an awful shame, especially as my daughters really liked the stories about Nut. Anytime I found a new story about the Milky Way, which was age appropriate, I would tell it to my daughters, and they really loved Nut. And so I took them to the Fitzwilliam, and we saw Nut in the flesh, as it were. And Sophie, one of my daughters, then drew this while eating a cookie. And I realized it's not just the story that's powerful, it's the image as well. This is a very powerful image of this arched woman protecting the world. And I decided that I had to have it. So I looked into this myself. And so I'm going to tell you about 2 papers that I published on this. The first one was published last year, and in the Journal of Astronomical History and Heritage, one of 2 mainline journals for cultural astronomy. And in that paper, I looked at ancient texts that have some descriptions of Nut, and I tried to compare that to planetarium simulations of what the Milky Way would look like in the ancient Egyptian night sky. And so we're going to look at 2,000 years of ancient Egyptian history. We're starting back in the Old Kingdom. This is where Egyptian history begins. The Old Kingdom is when the pyramids were built. And in those pyramids, the kings had spells carved into the walls. These are called the pyramid texts. And these spells are there to make sure that the king can make the transition to the afterlife and gain everlasting life. During the Middle Kingdom, no more pyramids. These spells evolved and transitioned into the coffins. And so you see them painted into coffins as the Coffin Texts. Then we go into the New Kingdom. where the pharaohs built, carved magnificent tombs into the valley, into the rock walls of the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. The New Kingdom is when we have all the different Ramseses and Hatshepsut and Seti and other famous pharaohs. And in their tombs, they decorated the walls with books. The Book of the Night, the Book of the Day, the Book of Gates, and something that used to be popularly called the Book of Nut, because it features a large image of Nut, but we now know is actually called the Fundamentals of the Course of the Stars, something that was discovered by the Egyptologist Alexandra von Lieven. And if you know German, then you can read her beautiful translation of this book from 2007. If you don't know German, good luck to you. Okay, so the Book of Nut, this is a version from the cenotaph of Seti I, includes several chapters, but the one that concerns us is the one that includes this image of Nut. And in this image, you can see her swallowing the sun. The sun has wings in this case. And you can also see it coming back up in the east at her foot. If you look very closely, you can also see the moon on her thigh, just above her, just to the side of her groin. And all along her back, this is the same table, or a similar table of decanal stars as the one I showed you in the astronomical ceiling from the tomb of Seti. And there's a lot of writing. Below her, to either side of Shu, that's a table of ephemerides. Okay, so this is an astronomical text. And to the sides, there are other texts that describe her. And some of what they say is what we already know. Her rear is in the east and her head is in the west. And some of it goes a bit deeper. It's not just that her head is in the west, it's that her head is the western horizon and her rear is the eastern horizon. It's also that she not only swallows the sun, in this case the king, it's that after she swallows the sun, she also swallows the stars that are behind him. And we think that here, what they mean, what the writers meant was these decanal stars. So, and rushing to their places means they're rising. And maybe the most important thing is that her arm is on the northwest side, her left arm is on the southeast side. This is a two-dimensional image. Most Egyptian paintings are two-dimensional, but this is a three-dimensional description. Okay? It describes her head as being the western horizon, her rear is the eastern horizon, and her arms are at a 45-degree angle to her body. And that had to have been very, very deliberate and specific. So we learn a few things. We learn that she actually has a three-dimensional aspect, and we learn that she has to be stationary on the sky. Her head has to be locked to the western horizon so that she can not only swallow the sun, but also all the other stars that come after. And her rear has to be locked to the eastern horizon because she has to give birth to the stars as they rise throughout the night and to the sun when it rises in the east. That tells me that you cannot map her body onto the Milky Way because the Milky Way is not stationary. The Milky Way also rises and sets. Yes, at any given point throughout the night, if you're in a very good location, you can see some part of the Milky Way. But if you follow that one part, if you look at Sagittarius or Gemini or Cygnus, it will cross the sky with all the other stars and it will set. Okay? So Nut cannot be the Milky Way. But what about her arms? Why this 45-degree angle? Well, if you look at what the Milky Way looks like in the Egyptian night sky, and it doesn't matter, ancient, not ancient, 3,000 years is nothing for astronomy, then, caveats, when the Milky Way is highest in the sky, so that it's most visible, okay, then throughout the winter months, the Milky Way's orientation is the same as Nut's arms. But during the summer months, it flips. So what do we do with that? So based on these texts, I suggested that, first of all, no, the Milky Way is not Nut. Nut is the sky. But the Milky Way might have been used as a way to illuminate her presence in the sky. So that during the winter months, you would look up and you would see the Milky Way basically delineating her arms. And then during the summer months, perhaps you were seeing it delineating her backbone. I pick on the word backbone because many, many cultures call the Milky Way the backbone of the night, including several cultures in Africa. Okay, now at this point, I had read a lot of different stories about the Milky Way, and the idea of an elongated, star-studded goddess who was the Milky Way was one that I had seen before. This is a page from the Codex Borgia, made by the Tlaxcaltec people of Mexico in pre-Columbian times, okay, so before the Spanish invaded. And several of these pages show at the bottom or the top this elongated, star-studded goddess. Susan Milbrath, an anthropologist, argues very convincingly, I have to say, that this is the star goddess Citlalique, also known as Mother of the Gods, the mother of Quetzalcoatl, who she's giving birth to in this image, who is associated with Venus. And this image then shows Venus crossing the Milky Way. So this idea of a goddess who gives birth to celestial objects and is associated with the Milky Way was not new to me. Nut is also very important in Egyptian culture, not because of her cosmological role, but because of her eschatological role, because of how she assists the deceased on their path to the afterlife. Nut is the embodiment of the coffin and the sarcophagus and the tomb. And she's often shown in this pose guarding the deceased. She is also one of the goddesses of the sycamore who give food and drink to the deceased and the spirit, the Ba, shown here as this human-headed bird. The Milky Way is also seen as a conduit between this life and the next. So again, this idea of a sky goddess who also takes part in the afterlife being connected to the Milky Way made sense. Nut is also described in the pyramid texts and the coffin texts as being a ladder which the king uses to rise up to the sky. She's described as giving her arm to the deceased so they can rise up to the sky. And finally, looking at echoes of this story in African origin stories, I found this story from southern Africa, where the creator god is called Nadima. And as the sun sets, Nadima bites off the head of the sun, and its true body is then carried by Nadima along the Milky Way to the east, where it regrows its top body, it regrows its head, and it can rise once again. It sounds very much like the solar cycle myth where Nut swallows the sun. Careful, okay? This is a contemporary story from southern Africa. I am not going to claim that this is the same story. I'm not going to claim transmission because I don't have a transmission route spanning 5,000 years and the entire continent of Africa. We do know that Egypt had trading relations with sub-Saharan Africa, but that was more than 2,000 years ago. Did that survive through oral tradition? There are cultural astronomers who argue that yes, such origin stories can survive for thousands of years. I am not wholly convinced by that. But I leave this here as, I would say, an interesting suggestion. Okay, so that's it. I was done. Okay, I was done. I gave a talk very much like this to the public here at Cambridge last year after this paper came out, and I was done. I felt that I had shown there was a link. I could include that image in my book. I was happy. I hope everyone else was happy. Done. Back to astrophysics, back to supernovae and TDs. But I started giving more talks like these, and when you give talks, you want to have the prettiest pictures. And one day on a more boring than normal telecon, I was surfing the web looking for images, and I saw this one. And this is the heart of the paper that was published last week. Now, you've seen this image now a few times, right? We have Shu holding up Nut. She's arched over her brother Geb. Okay. Only this time, she's not only covered in stars, but we have this undulating black curve that bisects her body from the tips of her fingers to the tips of her toes. And the stars are arrayed on either side. Okay? And if you're an astronomer and you look at that, you say, you know what? That looks like the Great Rift. That looks like the dark nebulae and dust that bifurcate the Milky Way. Not only that, but I had already seen the Milky Way shown as undulating curves on the bodies of spiritual beings. On the left, we have a Navajo sand painting showing Father Sky. You can see the sun and the moon with horns of power. You can see different constellations. And the Milky Way, Ikais Daha, is shown as this zigzag pattern along his arms and shoulders. In the center, we have a Hopi Katsina called Sungwuka. Sungwuka means, I've been told, means Milky Way. And I identify the Milky Way here as this zigzag pattern going down its face and along its snout. And on the right is a Zuni Katsina called Kiaklo. Personally, I love the duck, but Kiaklo wears two bands. The multicolored one is the rainbow. The checkered one is the Milky Way. And we know all of this from direct sources all the way back to the 19th century, as well as today. This Katsina was only made a few years ago and now hangs in my house. So this idea of the Milky Way being an undulating curve on the body of a spiritual being, something that's not new, that I had seen before in cultures that have nothing to do with ancient Egypt. So no cultural diffusion. Okay. I measure rates. I measure supernova rates. My group measures ECLE rates. When I see something that looks unique, I immediately ask, how unique? And so I started doing a survey of Egyptian coffins. I have to say, I could only do this because many of the world's largest Egyptology collections are now digitized and publicly available on the web from the different museums. And I thank them deeply for doing this, and I hope that other museums continue to do this. So I now have a database of about 570 coffins from all eras of Egyptian history, all the way from the 5th dynasty in the Old Kingdom down to Roman times. And out of those 500 coffins, there are 123 that show this so-called cosmological vignette. 118 of those come from one dynasty, the 21st dynasty, which only spanned about a century. Very short period of time to have so much of this one figure. All of these images, they are all from 21st dynasty coffins. And how often do we see this undulating curve? Just that once. Just that once. But then I showed my paper to an Egyptologist in Canada, Sarah Simons, and she said, hey, you know what? You should take a look at a couple of tombs from the Valley of the Kings, because I think I've seen something like this before. And I looked at the one she showed me, and then I found this in 2 other tombs. And you've seen this image before. I showed you this image at the very beginning, but I didn't say anything about these wavy lines in the middle. That's because most Egyptologists either didn't notice them, sometimes edited them out of their sketches, or just thought that they were a decorative motif. But in ancient Egyptian art, where everything could be symbolic, you do have to ask yourself, what if this means something? Okay, to me, it looks very much like the same undulating curve on that coffin, and it separates between the northern sky below and the southern sky above. And we know this is south and north. Nut is sometimes described as being the lord of the 2 skies. There is this idea in the pyramid texts that the sky is split in 2. And you can split the sky either using the Milky Way or using the ecliptic. And that's the big argument among Egyptologists. But this curve continues to appear in some other tombs. This is from the tomb of Ramses VI. On the bottom, you have the Book of the Day. And you'll just, at the very, very top, you're just seeing the beginning of a mirror image of Nut and the Book of the Night. In between the 2 images of Nut, you have these 2 undulating golden curves. They look like exactly the same as the ones in the tomb of Seti I, but now they're on Nut's body. And if you look closely, you'll see that they begin at the base of her neck, and then they travel above her back, and they curve over her ear. Okay? To me, that says that they are part of Nut. It's not just a decorative motif, something to have between the 2 images, but another aspect of Nut's body. And so with that, I started to think, okay, so in the New Kingdom, they started to incorporate that motif, and then the 21st dynasty comes immediately after the end of the New Kingdom. It traveled into one of these cosmological vignettes on the coffin of the chantress Nesita Ujatachet. What is it? What is this curve? I think that it could be this winding waterway, Mernecha. And as the winding waterway, I am starting to think more and more that this is the Milky Way. Some argue that it's the ecliptic. But the winding waterway is described as ferrying the sun from west to east. The ecliptic moves the planets from east to west. I don't see why the Egyptians would confuse this. They were very acute astronomers. I think they needed some kind of celestial object along which the sun could move after it had set. You can do that along the Great Rift, where you don't see anything. You can do that if the Milky Way is part of Nut's body, and the sun has to move through her body, which is the Duat. Bless you. There is also a constellation called the Boat, which Juan Antonio Belmonte and Jose Lul, in the wonderful, wonderful book from 2023, which is about 600 or 1,000 pages long. If you want to learn Egyptian astronomy, that's where you should go. If you're not an Egyptologist, good luck to you. So they argue that the boat should be identified with certain stars in the constellations, what we would call Sagittarius, Scorpius, and Libra. And all of those lie on the Milky Way. And to them that makes sense, because then the boat can sail on this celestial river. So, after three papers on this subject, do I still think that Nut is the Milky Way? No, Nut is not the Milky Way. They are linked, but they are not synonymous. I think that I have found the only textual evidence linking between them back in the fundamentals of the course of the stars. And I also think that I found visual evidence which shows that the Milky Way is this undulating curve that appears on one coffin from the 21st dynasty, 4 tombs from the New Kingdom, and I was sent this 2 days ago, a coffin from the Ptolemaic era, which is about 600 years after this coffin was made. So I think that the Milky Way is this winding waterway, Mernecha. I think Nut was the sky. And as the sky, anything that you see on the sky is associated with her and can be drawn on her when you depict her, which is why you see her depicted with stars, with solar disks, with the moon, with decanal stars, and I think the Milky Way. So this is the end of my talk. I will say, if you want to see Nut for yourself, you're lucky. You're only 15 minutes away from the Fitzwilliam Museum, which has a very nice Egyptology collection. There's a new exhibition opening in October that will feature lots of different artifacts. But there is a full coffin set, an outer, inner, and mummy board, which all feature different depictions of Nut. You can go on a scavenger hunt. I just told you there are 3. There are actually 2 more. So you can go on a scavenger hunt to look for the other 2. I really suggest seeing this in person. It's a different experience. So with that, I'll end here,